Hi, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg. I'm editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and I want to thank you all for joining this morning's event. This is an important conversation we're hosting today, and I want to get right to it. I want to note, though, that we at The Atlantic have launched on our website today a special feature that collects many of the articles we published across 3 centuries on issues related to race, articles from Frederick Douglass on forward to writers we published for the first time just this month. And we're including a link to that feature in the chat feature. Um, I'd like to introduce today's speakers very quickly. Lonnie Bunch is a good friend of The Atlantic, and he is also a great American, as is Adam Serwer, my colleague, of course. Lonnie is the first African-American to serve as head of the Smithsonian, and he's also the first historian to lead the institution, which is also sort of remarkable. He is best known worldwide, of course, as the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Adam Serwer, all of you know, he's one of our star writers and one of the country's most important and vital commentators and analysts of the Trump era. It's always on a personal note. It's always exciting for me to partner with the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian and the Atlantic are two great American institutions. The Smithsonian has more real estate, of course, than we do, but two great American institutions that have both traveled through history together. The Smithsonian was created in 1846. The Atlantic was born in 1857. Both institutions, in some ways, are committed to this very same ideal: to explain America to itself and to the world, to be town squares for argument and debate and illumination and refinement of the American idea. So we're very, very excited to have Lonnie Bunch with us today. I'm happy to welcome both Lonnie and Adam, and take it away, Adam.
Good morning, Secretary Bunch. Thank you for being here with us.
Good morning. My great pleasure.
So since George Floyd was killed by a police officer in Minnesota on May 25th, we've seen weeks of protests. Why do you think this is happening now?
Well, I've always felt that protest is the highest form of patriotism. It's where people demand a country live up to its stated ideals. And I think the pain that came with the murder of George Floyd, but with the sort of long history of this pain, I think people said, I'm tired of mourning. Let me do something besides mourn. Let me challenge a country to live up to its stated ideals. And I think that's what you're seeing in the protests.
So some activists and Black leaders have said that this moment feels different from, previous protests. Obviously, there have been outcries against police brutality before. I'm thinking of Ferguson, Baltimore. Do you agree that this moment is different? And if so, why or why not?
I think there are some parts of this that are different, but let's be honest. This is part of the long arc. What's clear is that this is part of an arc that says that as long as America has viewed itself as a democracy, it's also been a place of racism, of systematic racism and discrimination. So for me, this is something that I've seen many times before through the eyes of the past. What's different this time is that, one, you're seeing such a diversity of people around the world clamoring for America to do better, clamoring for the struggle against police violence to be taken seriously. But you're also seeing, I think, people who I've never heard speak before. I've seen police officers, some members of police departments and police chiefs raising questions about we can do better, we can do differently. I am hopeful that the fact that this is something that has gone on for a long time, that there is now a push that you begin to even see local political and national and regional political leaders actually doing something, getting involved in the conversation. So I am hopeful, but I'm not sure I'm optimistic, because we've seen this happen time and time again.
So a few political commentators have compared the situation that we're seeing today to the riots and uprisings that we saw in 1967, 1968. Do you see a parallel, or do you think this moment is different?
Well, I think that there's no doubt that as a result of the long, hot summers of the 1960s, what you see is America asking fundamental questions about the African-American experience. You see the birth of Black studies programs. You see movies and books that are written about the African-American experience. And you see legislation that leads to important changes. The Civil Rights Act of 64, down to the Fair Housing Act of 68. So you do see that there was a time of angst and change. And I think there are some parallels, but yet I have not seen the concrete product yet that I saw coming out of 1968. And the one thing that worries me about the parallel with 1968 is that when all was said and done, what is really one of the strongest legacies of 1968 is the kind of law and order notion that Richard Nixon campaigned with, that led to, I would argue, the kind of mass incarceration that we see today. So my concern is that as I'm hearing people talk about there's time to change, I also hear other people talking about law and order. And to me, it rings more of the sort of Nixon era than I'd like it to be.
So I'm going to come back to that, but one of the things I want to get to first is, there's a long history of Black protest associated with police brutality, as you've mentioned. Why has this historically been such a flashpoint for conflict?
Well, in some ways, the police, both officially and extra legally, have always been used to help control the African American community. If you look at the period of enslavement, you see that violence was one of the ways that you control this enslaved population. And that begins to then be transferred to the extra legal police and then the formal police as a way to control this community. And this community has always been the source of labor in the prison system. It's been the sort of area where you see time and time again the excessive police violence, whether it is in the 19th century into the 20th century. So this is a long history of people recognizing that the police, instead of protecting the Black community, often are the part of the community, that part of the country that attacks the Black community. So I think in ways, for me, part of this is a long struggle that has led to everything from reforms in policing, oversight committees. But the reality is that for African Americans, whether it's the 19th century or today, the police has always been something that one is more fearful of than appreciates. And I think every Black man in America either had the conversation with his parents about how to avoid being a victim of the police, or has at some point had run afoul of the criminal justice system. So in a way, this is a long history that I hope is being addressed, but it's been such an issue that I'm not sure that we're really at a point yet where we can really transform it.
So this is going to be a bit of a long question because I'm gonna quote from something from a government report. So in 1943, a report commissioned by Harry Truman found that, quote, "There's evidence of lawless police action against whites and Negroes alike, but the dominant pattern is that of race prejudice," end quote. The report describes circumstances where, quote, "Negroes have been shot, supposedly in self-defense, under circumstances indicating at best unsatisfactory police work in the handling of criminals, and at worst, a callous willingness to kill," end quote. So this is from 1943. And we've seen one government panel after another look into the issue of police brutality and the protests and riots in response over basically a century. The conclusions about the causes and the recommendations from these reports are almost always basically the same. So why haven't things changed?
Well, I think that often these reports become momentary flashpoints. People read them, people talk about them, then they're put on the shelf. In part because at every moment where there was a possibility of change, there was also the fear of law and order. And that the notion is that if you handcuff the police, that ultimately all the communities, Black and white, will suffer from the lack of police patrols. I think in a way, what it also tells you, however, is that until very recently, the leadership of police agencies were not people of color. We're not people who actually experienced some of this. So I think that there is an opportunity and a possibility now, but I have to be honest, looking back to the 40s, to the 50s, to the 60s, what I hope is that we don't put a Band-Aid on something and hope that that Band-Aid will heal and lead to transformation. Maybe this is the time that we can fundamentally rethink the role of policing, the role of the police in the community. But like I said, I'm hopeful, but I'm not optimistic.
So activists have said that these protests aren't about the president in particular, but but some of the larger issues that we've discussed in this conversation. At the same time, when the president said when the looting starts, the shooting starts, and he's like frequently invoked the phrase law and order, which you've mentioned here today is a pretty loaded phrase. He's drawn a lot of criticism for fanning the flames. How historically have police responded to Black protest, and how does the president's response factor in?
I think that usually Black protests are seen as challenging the system, and the police are there to protect the system. And so I think that what you hope is that political leadership from the White House through Congress to the local level will recognize that law and order does not necessarily mean break the backs of the Black community. Law and order does not necessarily mean that it is the African Americans that bear the burden of this. What you really hope to see is that this is about both fundamental change in policing, but also fundamental change in racial attitudes. That this is really about a broader notion of forcing a country to confront racism in all of its permutations, and thinking very strategically, creatively, but candidly, boldly about how do you affect that kind of permanent change. And again, I have only seen hints of that throughout our history. So therefore, even this moment has great possibility, but I'm not sure that possibility is going to be realized.
So you just mentioned that you think that the protests are about confronting racial prejudice and all its permutations. The protests have obviously been largely focused on police, but in your view, are they about something larger, or to what is the context in which these police protests are happening are related to a bigger issue of systemic racism in our society? And if so, can you talk a little bit about that?
I think what's important is that right now the lens is on policing, and rightly so. But if you step back, the aperture is bigger than that. It is really about systematic racism throughout, not just the police department, but out many parts of the American system. It's also about saying that we have to revisit economic considerations. We have to look at how we ensure that the country really models the diversity it says it accepts. In many ways, for me, that I hope this changes the way the police do their business. But more importantly, what I hope it does is allow us to revisit and say, how do we help America, as Langston Hughes said, be America? How do we help a country live up to its stated ideals of fairness? And for me, this is the moment to say, let us all figure out how we can contribute to that fairness, to challenging that country. And it's really about challenging. It's working collectively, but it's challenging to say that if we are what we say we are, then we've got to confront this racism that has really been at the heart of the American system from its inception.
When you look at the history of Black protests, from the March in Selma to the sit-ins, how has Black protest historically shifted the conversation or affected public policy? And you mentioned the Fair Housing Act earlier, obviously, but there's other examples.
Well, I think that what protest does is it really dramatically sheds light on important issues. And when you look at protests around the world, whether it's the anti-apartheid movement, whether it's the civil rights movement, that protest really has affected change, sometimes profound and transformative. So for me, protest is really important. I think it is protest that helps to hold cities, politicians, governments accountable. And so I am very interested in recognizing that historically protests, whether it is the NAACP protesting against lynching, helping to create movements of Black women and white women to push for anti-lynching legislation, which unfortunately didn't pass, but nonetheless, I see these moments as the moments where America has been changed and can continue to be changed. So for me, I would always argue that protests, especially African-American protests, has really helped the country change. It's helped the country redefine citizenship. It's raised fundamental questions about economic fairness. So I feel strongly that protest really does matter. And it matters in terms of illuminating issues. It matters in terms of getting people passionate about voting. And it matters because it forces people to think about, what does it mean to be an American? And what does it mean for America to live up to its ideals?
So the president recently changed his plans to hold a rally on Juneteenth in Tulsa, which is of course the site of the Tulsa massacre in 1921. After there was a big backlash to his decision, do you see a lot? Are you witnessing? Obviously, you have, as you mentioned earlier, you've seen a lot of examples of these protests. Are you seeing a wider awareness of the reality of Black history specific, as well as, the Tulsa massacre is one example, but are you seeing a larger awareness among white Americans or among Americans who are not Black about the specifics of Black history and the sort of nature of the oppression that Black Americans have historically faced?
In some ways, we're seeing a parallel to what happened in the late 1960s, early 70s. You have people who are suddenly saying, I didn't know about Tulsa. What is Juneteenth? And you're finding people who are fascinated by trying to understand not just the history of Black America, but the history of America through an African-American lens. And so what I hope that comes out of this is a desire to understand and embrace our history. I think it's crucially important that often America is a place that's ahistorical or selectively historical, and that it would be crucial to help people understand how the African-American experience has shaped not just the Black community, but shaped the American experience. So it's the quintessential American story. So what I find fascinating is, I got a call the other night from somebody saying, but explain Juneteenth to me. So there is an interest in this history, but what I hope is this interest will then allow people to recognize how to use that history to keep challenging the country, to say, how long do we mourn? How many times do we have to talk about Tulsa-like activities? How many Black men or bodies are broken by the police? At a certain point, my hope is that history gives people the kind of inspiration to challenge and to change, and it helps people understand that change comes from strategic activity, and it comes from resiliency, and it doesn't come without loss. So my hope is that people will understand the role that African Americans have played, and to dip into that reservoir of history and to use that reservoir to help push change.
So you're one of the most prominent museum historians in the country, and we've seen a tremendous amount of media from these protests, from videos to photos. How do these images shape the public perception in response to the protests, and also ultimately our public memory of them?
I think that first of all, it's really important to recognize what a visual culture we are. And so therefore, the notion of being able to see candidly the killing and murder of George Floyd was unbelievably powerful, because we have known these things have happened before, and we've seen things like the beating of Rodney King in the 1990s. But to now be able to both see it and to share it via social media, I think that really is something that gets people to understand that this is not just a single action or a single moment. And so I think that for me, it's important to recognize that part of the job of museums, for example, is to collect this moment, to make sure that this history, that the visual history of this is collected so that we can tell the story now, but that this, I would argue, is going to be a crucial story to understand 50 years from now. And so I think it's the visual aspects of this that make this real, that make it concrete for so many people. We can tell so many stories about the murder of African Americans, about discrimination, but to see it, and to see it in live action, really, I think, is part of how a country is transformed.
So I just want to remind viewers that some of you have already submitted questions, but that you can submit questions on the Q&A tab. So you talked about this a little bit, but one of the more traumatic uses of media here is the documentation of police killings of Black people. And these images are often very graphic, and they're shared over and over and over. Do you have any thoughts on how the press and regular people can use such images responsibly without making Black death a form of entertainment?
Well, I think that's really the challenge, right? The challenge is that this then becomes exotic and it becomes something that, like a movie rather than reality. I was struck the other night watching something and they ran the same image 15, 20 times. And at a certain point, it loses its impact. At a certain point, it becomes not real. And so I think the challenge here is to recognize that these are moments of real sadness, moments of real tragedy, and they deserve to be treated as such. They tend to be seen as something that is part of, in some ways, not just the education, but almost the entertainment. And what I want to make sure is that we recognize that these are real people who have suffered, who have been murdered. And so, therefore, what I'm hoping is that we will not look at this as an exotic use of the Black body, but rather use this as what it is. It deserves to be respected and revered and mourned appropriately.
So I'm going to ask a question that it was submitted from a viewer named Nicole. A lot of pushback against the protests now critique looting or rioting as socially unacceptable forms of demonstration. Historically, how has respectability politics been used against protesters and movements? The relationship between, quote, civility and racial justice movements?
I think that for a lot of people, we celebrate nonviolent protests. And I think that's what we want to see. And in fact, so many of the protesters today are nonviolent. But we also have to realize that protest takes a variety of forms. Sometimes we think of the long, hot summers of the 1960s and the urban unrest. And people said, well, how dare they break the law? How dare they loot? Well, those are really, that kind of protest is really one of the few ways the voiceless feel they have power. And while I am opposed to violent protests personally, I understand that frustration sometimes pushes you over the edge. And I think what's important for us to recognize is, let us not turn attention towards looting in a way that takes away what is the power of these protests, which are protests that want us to remember the murder of George Floyd, protests that want to challenge the country to be better. And so what I want to make sure is that while we acknowledge and are concerned about the looting, that the looting does not take center stage and move us away from what this really is, which is a clarion call for America to change, a clarion call for this to finally be that tipping point that helps America live up to what it says it is.
I have another question from a viewer named Connie who's asking, how and when will the Smithsonian be developing exhibits based on the present social situation of protests?
I think, first of all, it's important that the first thing the Smithsonian is doing is collecting these moments. We have staff who are collecting the banners, interviewing people, getting videos that protesters have taken from all around the country. And I think that we feel it's important that institutions like the Smithsonian do their part at a time like this. So my expectation is that there will be exhibitions, there will be programs around this. I think it's important that one of the things that we're doing at the Smithsonian is we've created an initiative that's been supported by Bank of America that's going to look at race, community, and our shared future, to recognize that the Smithsonian is a trusted source that can bring people together to grapple with these issues, not just to have conversation, but to look at these issues from a national and local level, to try to affect change, to make sure that we have a groundswell of support of people who recognize that this is the time to grapple with what has divided us. This is the time to find that common ground that can change a country. And so the Smithsonian, like many cultural institutions, are committed to helping a country be made better.
I have another question here from Saren. What are your thoughts on corporations' recent statements on the Black Lives Matter movement when they haven't made similar statements before? Do you think it's sincere? Do you think it's performative? What are we to make of it?
Well, I think that in some ways, the fact that corporations are making these statements, but also are thinking about ways that they can contribute, provide resources to support these efforts, I think it's important. I think that it's still too early to say, is this more than lip service? But I'm feeling the fact that so many corporations feel the need to speak out, tells us both about the impact of this moment, but it also tells us that many of these corporations have a more diverse staff than they did 20 years ago or 25 years ago. And so they're also responding to the pain, frustration, fear, and anger that their staffs express. So I think that this is something where we can see this as unusual and maybe transformative. But again, it's still too early to tell.
Do you think that this moment is going to lead to lasting change? Are you hopeful about where America goes from here?
Like I said, I'm hopeful, but not optimistic. I'm hopeful because as a student of history, I think about how African Americans dreamed of a world that no one believed existed, dreamed of a world that there wasn't slavery, that African Americans struggled to find ways to make segregation something that they could still find lives and happiness and family, and yet found ways to challenge America to change that notion of segregation. So I look at this as African Americans as a people who believe in the resiliency and the possibility of change. So on the one hand, I'm hopeful, but because I've seen great leaps forward, but then those leaps sort of stopped, I'm not sure how profound, how transformative the change would be. I want to be proven wrong. I want to be able to say that this is the moment that the country made that great leap forward. But at this stage, again, I'm hopeful. I see some optimistic signs, but we've been here before.
Secretary Bunch, thank you so much for joining us. For more on this conversation, please visit theatlantic.com. The collection page is linked. Sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you.